Have you ever been so thoroughly underestimated that your very existence felt like a secret? Have you ever stood in a room where everyone has already written your story for you, filling the pages with their own prejudices and assumptions, never once thinking to ask you for the truth? We build walls around people based on what we see: a worn jacket, the color of a person's skin, a quiet demeanor. We use these bricks of bias to construct a fortress of judgment, and from behind its safety, we decide who they are, what they're capable of, and what they're worth. But what happens when the person you've locked outside the castle walls is the very architect who drew the blueprints? The story you are about to hear is a testament to that question. It unfolded in a place where truth is supposed to be sacred, a courtroom. But on this day, the truth was hidden in plain sight, waiting patiently inside the calmest man in the room. The chamber itself felt ancient and imposing, paneled in dark, solemn wood that had absorbed a century of whispered pleas and shouted objections. Sunlight struggled through the tall, arched windows, cutting dusty golden shafts through the air, illuminating the stage for the day's drama. At the center of this stage was Marcus Thorne, a man who wore his success like a second skin. His suit was a masterpiece of tailoring, a dark charcoal armor that cost more than most people's cars. His shoes gleamed with a ferocious polish, and his silver hair was combed back with a precision that spoke of a life devoid of chaos. He was a shark in this wood and marble ocean, and he moved with the predatory grace of a creature at the top of the food chain. He was defending a multi-billion-dollar chemical conglomerate, a titan of industry accused of systematically poisoning the air in a low-income neighborhood. For Thorne, this wasn't about justice. It was a game of strategy, and he was a grandmaster. His opponent, the community, was a pawn he intended to sacrifice without a second thought. And then, the clerk called the name. The prosecution calls Elias Vance to the stand. The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, and Elias Vance walked through. The shift in the room's atmosphere was immediate and palpable. If Thorne was a creature of the courtroom, Elias was a man of the earth, and he seemed to bring the scent of soil and open air into the sterile environment. He wore a simple navy blue work shirt, clean but softened with age, and dark trousers that had seen better days. He was a tall man, with a quiet strength in his frame, but he held himself with a humility that made him seem smaller. His skin was a deep, rich brown, and his hands, as he walked to the witness stand, were large and calloused, the hands of a man who worked with them. The jury looked at him, their expressions a mixture of pity and dismissal. The bailiff, a man jaded by years of courtroom theater, barely gave him a second glance. Thorne watched him approach, a slow, contemptuous smile spreading across his face. This was perfect. This man was the face of the opposition. This simple, unassuming man was the David to his corporate Goliath. This would be easier than he thought. Elias sat, his back straight, his gaze sweeping once over the room before settling forward. He was the voice for an entire community, the embodiment of their pain and their hope. Children were sick. Elderly residents were developing coughs that never went away. The very air they breathed was a betrayal. Elias was here to speak for them, a lone, quiet figure against the roaring engine of corporate power and legal manipulation. He looked like a gardener, a janitor, a man completely and utterly out of his depth. And in that moment, everyone in the room, from the judge to the jury to the smug attorney, believed they knew exactly who he was. The cross-examination began not with a question, but with an insult wrapped in condescending politeness. Marcus Thorne approached the witness stand, his polished shoes making no sound on the plush carpet. He circled it slowly, like a predator sizing up its prey. He stopped and leaned on the railing, his posture one of relaxed, absolute dominance. "Mr. Vance, is it?" he purred, the question itself a subtle dismissal, as if the name were too insignificant to remember correctly. Elias met his gaze, his own expression unreadable. "It is," he replied, his voice even and calm, without a trace of the defensiveness Thorne was trying to provoke. Thorne straightened up, turning to address the jury with a theatrical sweep of his arm. "And Mr. Vance, the prosecution has presented you as a key witness. So, for the benefit of the court, could you please tell us what it is you do exactly? Your official title is community organizer?" The words were delivered with a slight sneer, each syllable dripping with disdain. He made the title sound like a child's make-believe profession. "What does that entail precisely? Do you organize neighborhood potlucks? Plant flowers in the community garden? Perhaps you hold bake sales to raise funds?" The gallery, filled with Thorne's corporate entourage, chuckled softly. The trap was set. Thorne wanted Elias to become angry, to get flustered, to defend his life's work with an emotional outburst that would immediately discredit him in the eyes of the jury. An emotional witness is an unreliable witness. Elias didn't take the bait. His hands remained resting, one on top of the other on his lap. He didn't fidget. He didn't scowl. He simply waited for the condescending laughter to die down. "It means," Elias said, his voice cutting through the residual murmurs with quiet authority, "that I listen to my neighbors when they tell me their children can't play outside without getting a rash. It means I sit with elders who are afraid of the strange smell that comes in through their windows at night. It means I collect data on the rising number of asthma cases in our local clinic. And when a community is hurting and its people feel voiceless, it means I speak for them." The simplicity and sincerity of his answer momentarily wiped the smirk from Thorne's face. The jury shifted in their seats. This wasn't the rambling emotional response they had been led to expect. But Thorne was a master of recovery. He scoffed, a short, sharp sound of disbelief, and began pacing again, his energy frantic and aggressive, a stark contrast to the witness's profound stillness. "So, you're an activist," Thorne declared, twisting the word into an accusation. "An emotional advocate, not a factual expert. You deal in feelings, in anecdotes, in the fears of the uneducated. But we are in a court of law, Mr. Vance, a place of facts, of statutes, of cold, hard evidence. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" He was painting a picture for the jury. Elias, the well-meaning but ignorant amateur, meddling in the complex and serious world of industry and law. Elias's gaze remained fixed on the attorney. It was a look of intense, analytical focus. He wasn't cowering. He wasn't intimidated. He was observing, studying, as if Thorne himself were a specimen under a microscope. The dramatic irony was a thick, palpable tension in the air. Thorne believed he was the one in control, the one with all the knowledge and power. He had no idea that the man he was trying to belittle possessed a knowledge so deep and so specific, it would soon bring his entire world crashing down. The quiet man in the worn shirt was a hidden gem, a sleeping giant, and Marcus Thorne was foolishly, arrogantly poking him with a stick. Having established his narrative of Elias as an emotional amateur, Marcus Thorne decided it was time to deliver the killing blow. He moved to his table, where a stack of thick, leather-bound books sat like a monument to his own intellect. He selected the heaviest volume, its spine embossed with gold lettering, The Clean Air and Community Protection Act of 2011. He held it up for the jury to see, a prop in his elaborate performance. "This, members of the jury, is the law," he announced, his voice booming with self-importance. "Not feelings, not stories. The law." He strode back towards Elias, the book held in one hand like a stone tablet. Mr. Vance, I'm sure a man of your practical background isn't familiar with the finer points of statutory interpretation, but let's try our best, shall we? He opened the book, his fingers flipping through the pages with feigned expertise. Let's turn to the heart of the matter. Section 4, which deals with industrial emissions standards. Specifically, he paused for dramatic effect, running his finger down a page. Subparagraph C of Section 4.2. Are you familiar with it? Of course you're not. He didn't wait for an answer. He began spewing a torrent of legal jargon, his words chosen not for clarity but for confusion. The doctrine of expressio unius est exclusio alterius clearly applies here, dictating that the specific mention of certain regulated pollutants implies the exclusion of others not mentioned. Furthermore, the legislative intent, which we can glean from the Associated Committee reports, points towards a framework that balances environmental concerns with what the statute calls critical economic viability. It's all very complex, you see. He was building a fortress of words, each one a brick designed to wall Elias out. Elias listened patiently, his expression unchanged. He was letting Thorne build his own prison. Thorne finally landed on the point he had been constructing. Now, right here in subparagraph C, the law provides a clear and unambiguous exemption for what it terms incidental emissions that occur during economic viability operations. Incidental, Mr. Vance. My client's facility was undergoing a necessary system upgrade to improve efficiency, a perfect example of an economic viability operation. The emissions released were an unfortunate but legally permissible byproduct of this essential work. He closed the book with a loud, definitive thud. He looked from the jury to Elias, his face a mask of smug triumph. This was checkmate. How could a simple community organizer possibly argue with the printed words of the law itself? He expected Elias to stammer, to look to the prosecutor for help, to admit defeat. He expected the witness to say, "I don't know," or "I don't understand legal terms." He had laid the perfect trap, using the very law the community was depending on as the weapon against them. The silence in the courtroom was heavy. The jury looked confused by the legal speak but convinced by Thorne's confidence. The prosecutor looked worried, shuffling her papers, searching for a way to counter the seemingly airtight argument. Thorne had twisted the law into a shield for his client, and it appeared impenetrable. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. For a full 10 seconds, Elias Vance said nothing. He simply sat there, a statue of calm in the swirling currents of the courtroom. The judge, a seasoned jurist named Eleanor Thompson, leaned forward in her high-backed chair. She was accustomed to Thorne's theatrics, often finding them tiresome, but this was different. She wasn't just annoyed, she was intrigued by the witness's profound lack of reaction. Fear, anger, confusion. These were the expected responses. Elias displayed none of them. His stillness was a question mark hanging in the air. Marcus Thorne, however, saw only what he wanted to see. He interpreted the silence not as contemplation but as capitulation. It was the blank stare of a man who was intellectually overwhelmed, a mind shutting down in the face of superior firepower. He had won. Now it was time to gloat, to add a final, personal twist of the knife. He took a step closer to the witness box, invading Elias's personal space. He lowered his voice to a conspiratorial whisper, a venomous, intimate hiss that was nonetheless picked up by the sensitive microphone on the stand. His face was inches from Elias's. "You see, Mr. Vance," he murmured, his breath smelling of expensive coffee and self-satisfaction. "This is a different world. It's complicated. You don't understand how this works." It was the ultimate act of condescension, a final pat on the head to the ignorant child he believed he was schooling. And, in that moment, the entire trajectory of the trial and of Marcus Thorne's day shifted on its axis. The narrator's voice could have boomed through the courtroom at that very second, stating the simple, devastating truth. He was wrong. A change finally came over Elias Vance. It wasn't a sudden burst of anger or a flicker of fear. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. He blinked slowly, a long, deliberate closing and opening of his eyes, as if clearing his vision to see the man before him more clearly. He tilted his head, a gesture of mild curiosity, as one might observe a strange insect. The unnerving focus in his eyes sharpened. He had been listening, he had been observing, and now he was ready to act. He ignored Thorne completely, breaking their intense proximity by turning his head and addressing the bench directly. His voice, when it came, was as steady as a rock. "Your Honor," he said, respectfully, but with a new edge of purpose. "Mr. Thorne has been quoting from a document. May I see the text he is referring to?" The request was simple, reasonable, yet it landed in the silent courtroom with the force of a thrown gauntlet. It was a challenge. Thorne, still leaning in, recoiled as if struck. The question was not what he expected. Why would the lamb ask to see the butcher's knife? A flicker of uncertainty, the first of the day, crossed his face. Judge Thompson's eyebrows shot up. Her intrigue had blossomed into full-blown fascination. The quiet man was fighting back, not with emotion, but with a calm, tactical request. The game had just become interesting. Judge Thompson peered down from the bench, her gaze shifting from the suddenly flustered Marcus Thorne to the composed witness. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of her lips. "Of course, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice crisp and clear. "The witness is entitled to review any document used during his cross-examination. Bailiff, please provide Mr. Vance with a copy of the Clean Air and Community Protection Act." Thorne immediately snapped back to life, his arrogance surging back to mask his momentary confusion. "Objection, Your Honor," he barked, his voice a little too loud. "What is the purpose of this? The witness is not a legal scholar. He's a community organizer. Giving him the text would be pointless. It will only serve to waste the court's time as he struggles to comprehend the complex legal language." His objection was a thinly veiled continuation of his attack on Elias's intelligence. He was trying to reassert his control, to remind everyone in the room of the intellectual hierarchy he had so carefully constructed. Judge Thompson was not amused. She leveled a stern gaze at the defense attorney. "Mr. Thorne, your objection is noted, and it is overruled," she stated, her tone leaving no room for argument. "It is your exhibit. You chose to bring this text into the proceedings and question the witness on its specific contents. He has every right to see the words you are putting to him. Proceed, bailiff." Thorne's jaw tightened. He had been publicly rebuked. He shot a venomous glare at Elias as the bailiff, a burly man with a perpetually bored expression, carried the heavy legislative tome over to the witness stand. The bailiff placed the book before Elias with a thud. The entire courtroom watched, a collective breath held in anticipation. What would he do? Would he stare at it blankly, proving Thorne's point? Would he stumble over the first sentence? The moment felt charged, pivotal. Elias looked down at the book, and then he did something that sent a ripple of unease through Marcus Thorne. He didn't handle it like a foreign object. He didn't treat it with the tentative awe of someone unfamiliar with such things. He reached out and placed a hand on the leather cover, a gesture of profound, almost tender familiarity. His calloused fingers, the fingers Thorne had silently mocked, traced the embossed golden letters of the title. It was like watching a master craftsman greet an old tool. Then he opened it. He didn't start at the beginning and flip through randomly. His movements were fluid, economical, and unnervingly precise. His fingers danced across the edges of the pages, a blur of motion, as he navigated the dense document not by searching, but by memory. It took him less than 3 seconds. He stopped at a specific page, his finger landing squarely on a block of text in the middle of the chapter. He didn't need to hunt for the section Thorne had mentioned. He knew exactly where it was. He knew the book's geography. He knew it like the back of his own hand. He looked up, his calm eyes sweeping past the stunned face of Marcus Thorne, past the intrigued judge, and settling directly on the 12 men and women of the jury. The quiet man was gone. In his place was an authority they had not seen before, an expert who had been hiding in plain sight. Elias Vance's voice, when he spoke, was the same calm and measured tone he had used all along, but it now resonated with a newfound power that commanded the attention of every person in the room. It was the voice of absolute certainty. "Mr. Thorne," he began, his gaze still fixed on the jury, forcing them into a direct conversation. "You directed the court's attention to Section 4, subparagraph C, of the Clean Air and Community Protection Act." He paused, letting the statement settle. "You were correct about the section number." Another pause, this one more pointed. The jury leaned in. "But you seem to have either misread the content or perhaps," he tilted his head slightly, "you misunderstood its intent." A quiet gasp came from the prosecutor's table. Marcus Thorne's face, which had been a mask of arrogant confidence, began to show the first hairline cracks of panic. This was not going according to plan. Elias lowered his eyes to the book, though it was clear he didn't need it. The words were a part of him. "You claimed that subparagraph C provides a blanket exemption for incidental emissions. It does not." He began to read, his voice clear and articulate, enunciating every word with perfect clarity. "And I quote directly from the text, incidental emissions, defined as unscheduled releases of pollutants during maintenance, upgrade, or emergency shutdown procedures, must be documented and reported to the Regional Environmental Authority within 24 hours of the event." He looked up from the book, his eyes finding Thorne's. 24 hours, Mr. Thorne. Your client's own records submitted as evidence show they waited 2 weeks to file a report, and only after the community had already lodged formal complaints. That is a direct violation, not an exemption. Thorne was speechless. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Elias wasn't finished. He was just getting started. With the same unnerving precision as before, he flipped forward a dozen pages in the heavy volume. "Furthermore," he continued, his voice gaining momentum, "the clause you quoted is explicitly conditional. It is subject to limitations outlined elsewhere in the Act. Specifically," he tapped his finger on the new page, "it is subject to review if the emissions exceed the particulate matter threshold as defined in Appendix B of this very document." He lifted his gaze again, this time letting it sweep across the entire courtroom. "An appendix, Mr. Thorne, that you conveniently failed to mention." The cracks in Thorne's composure widened into fissures. He was no longer a predator, he was prey, caught in a trap he didn't even know existed. The jury was now looking at Thorne with open suspicion. The complex legal argument he had built with such confidence was being dismantled, brick by brick, by the very man he had dismissed as an ignorant amateur. The power dynamic in the room had not just shifted, it had been completely inverted. Elias Vance, the quiet man, the gardener, the activist, was now the expert. He held the law in his hands, not as a weapon to be twisted, but as a shield to be properly wielded, and he was using it to expose the truth with the calm, devastating precision of a master surgeon. The courtroom was his operating theater, and Marcus Thorne's arrogance was the disease he was methodically, expertly cutting away. You also spoke at length about legislative intent, Mr. Thorne, Elias continued, his voice a steady, rhythmic cadence that filled the now silent courtroom. You wove a compelling narrative for the jury, suggesting that the core purpose of this law was to protect the economic viability of corporations, treating community health as a secondary, almost trivial concern. He shook his head slowly, a gesture not of anger, but of profound disappointment. That is a very interesting and very convenient interpretation of the intent behind this legislation. He then did something that stunned the court even more. He closed the massive book with a soft, final click. He pushed it gently aside. He didn't need it anymore. The words were not on the page. They were in his heart, etched into his memory by countless hours of labor and conviction. I can speak to the legislative intent with some authority, Mr. Thorne, he said, his eyes locking onto the attorney's, who now looked pale and visibly sweating. You see, when the Clean Air and Community Protection Act was being drafted in 2011, there was a fierce debate. Corporate lobbyists, much like the ones who employ you now, fought tooth and nail to weaken its provisions. They wanted loopholes. They wanted vague language. They wanted economic viability to be a get-out-of-jail-free card. The members of the jury were on the edge of their seats, their faces rapt with attention. This was no longer a dry legal proceeding. It was a story, and Elias was a master storyteller. But there was a small team in Senator Alistair Miller's office, Elias went on, his voice taking on a narrative quality. A team that fought back. They believed that the health of a community, the right for a child to breathe clean air, was not something to be balanced against profits. They believed it was a fundamental right. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. The primary author of the supplementary clauses on community impact, the very language that defines the particulate matter thresholds in that Appendix B you ignored, was a young legislative aide, a policy advisor. Elias's gaze drifted for a moment, as if looking back in time. He wasn't a lawyer. He was just a kid from a neighborhood not unlike the one we're discussing today. He worked on this legislation pro bono in the evenings, after his regular day job was done. He would stay in the office until 2 or 3 in the morning, fueled by cheap coffee and a burning sense of purpose, poring over environmental studies and drafting language that was strong enough to protect people. The personal detail was riveting. Thorne, who had tried to paint Elias as an outsider to this world, was now forced to listen to a story from its very heart. He looked lost, adrift in a narrative he could not control. This aide, Elias said, his voice lowering slightly, becoming more personal. He had a reason. He had watched his own grandmother, a strong woman who had worked her whole life, struggle to take a full breath because a factory had moved in down the street a few years earlier. He knew this wasn't an abstract issue. It was about life and death, breath by breath. The courtroom was utterly still. The dramatic irony was reaching its crescendo. The prosecutor had a hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with dawning realization. Judge Thompson had abandoned all pretense of judicial impartiality. She was leaning forward, her entire being focused on the man in the witness box. Marcus Thorne stood frozen, a statue of crumbling arrogance, as the identity of the hidden gem, the overlooked virtuoso, was about to be revealed. Elias Vance continued his story, weaving the personal and the political into a single, powerful thread. He was no longer just a witness. He had become the living embodiment of the law itself. "That young aide," he said, his voice resonating with the memory of past battles, "was obsessed with closing the very loopholes you've tried to exploit today, Mr. Thorne. He was the one who insisted on mandatory, time-sensitive reporting. He was the one who argued for days that the term incidental needed a strict, narrow definition, so it couldn't be abused by companies looking to cut corners at the expense of public health." He gestured vaguely towards the book he had pushed aside. He wrote the phrase, "paramount duty of care" to the residential populace. You will find that exact phrase in the preamble of the Act, Mr. Thorne. A preamble which, as any first-year law student could tell you, sets the interpretive framework for the entire statute. It is the guiding principle. It clarifies the legislative intent beyond any doubt. The intent was not to balance profits and health. The intent was to declare that health, the well-being of the people, comes first. Always. The prosecuting attorney, a sharp woman named Maria Flores, slowly rose to her feet. A broad, incredulous smile was spreading across her face. She had put Elias on the stand thinking he was a compelling community voice, a victim. She had no idea she had brought the author of the law himself into the courtroom. She felt like she had brought a knife to a gunfight, only to watch her witness reveal he was carrying a cannon. Marcus Thorne, meanwhile, looked as though the floor had dropped out from beneath him. The blood had drained from his face, leaving it a pasty, sickly white. His mind was racing, trying to process the impossible. The man he had mocked, the man he had dismissed as a simpleton, was deconstructing his entire career's worth of arrogance with a calm, history-laden lecture. He was being humiliated by the ghost of the law's creation. Judge Thompson finally broke her captivated silence. Her voice was soft, filled with a sense of awe that she did not try to hide. "Mr. Vance," she began, leaning even further over the bench, her eyes locked on his. "You speak of this aid with such familiarity, such detail." She paused, the question hanging in the air, pregnant with the answer everyone now suspected. "Are you telling this court, are you telling us that you were that legislative aid?" The courtroom held its collective breath. All eyes were on Elias, the bailiff, the jury, the lawyers, the reporters in the gallery. Everyone was frozen, waiting for the final, definitive confirmation. Elias Vance turned his gaze from the crumbling figure of Marcus Thorne and looked directly at the judge. For the first time that day, a faint, weary smile touched his lips. It was not a smile of triumph, but of acknowledgment, of a long-held secret finally coming into the light. He gave a simple, humble nod. "Yes, Your Honor," he said, his voice quiet but echoing in the silent chamber. "I am. My name is Elias Vance. For 6 years, I served as a senior policy advisor in Senator Miller's office. Before I returned home to organize my community, I was the lead author on the Clean Air and Community Protection Act of 2011. The dam of silence broke. The courtroom didn't erupt into chaos, but into a tidal wave of astonished sound. There were gasps, sharp intakes of breath, and then a ripple of disbelieving laughter that grew into a wave of applause from the public gallery. Reporters were scribbling furiously in their notepads, their faces alight with the realization that this was not just a story, but the story. The jury was a tableau of shock and revelation. They looked at each other, then at the deflated Marcus Thorne, and then back to Elias Vance, their expressions transforming from pity and skepticism into profound, unadulterated respect. They were not just looking at a witness anymore. They were looking at a hero. And then there was Marcus Thorne, the architect of his own demise. His carefully constructed world of arrogance and superiority had been publicly and spectacularly demolished. His face was a burning crimson, a stark contrast to the deathly pallor of moments before. He opened his mouth to object, to say something, anything, to stop the hemorrhaging of his dignity, but only a dry, croaking sound came out. Objection, relevance, he stammered, the words meaningless and pathetic. His hand, shaking uncontrollably, knocked over a glass of water on his table, the liquid spreading across his meticulously arranged papers, blurring the ink, a perfect metaphor for his dissolving case. He dropped his expensive fountain pen with a clatter that sounded like a gunshot in the suddenly quiet room. He had been so sure of his power, so certain of his intellect, that he never once considered the possibility that the man he looked down upon was, in fact, looking down on him from a height of knowledge and integrity he could never hope to reach. Judge Thompson grabbed her gavel, but it was a perfunctory gesture. She banged it twice on the block, a wide, appreciative smile on her face. "Order!" she called out, her voice laced with amusement. "Order in the court." The murmuring subsided, but the electric energy remained. She turned her gaze upon the broken figure of Marcus Thorne. Her expression hardened. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice dripping with ice, "given this revelation, I suggest you take a moment. Perhaps you'd like to reconsider your line of questioning." She paused, letting him stew in his public humiliation. "Or perhaps," she added, delivering the final blow, "you'd like to reconsider your entire defense strategy. The court will take a 15-minute recess." With another bang of the gavel, she rose and swept from the room, leaving Thorne alone in the wreckage. Through it all, Elias Vance simply sat there. He hadn't gloated. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't celebrated his victory. He remained a portrait of quiet dignity, his hands resting calmly in his lap once more. He had won, not by becoming like his opponent, but by staying true to who he was. His worth, hidden for so long beneath a cloak of humility and prejudice, had finally been revealed, not because he demanded it, but because the truth, when given a chance, will always find its own way into the light. The quiet man had roared. The story, of course, did not end there. The recess stretched from 15 minutes into an hour, as Marcus Thorne and his team of corporate lawyers scrambled behind closed doors. When they returned, Thorne was a changed man. The swagger was gone, replaced by a gray, hollowed-out demeanor. He approached the bench, avoided eye contact with Elias, and meekly informed the judge that his client wished to enter into immediate settlement negotiations with the community. It was a complete and unconditional surrender. In the weeks that followed, the corporation was held to account. They paid a historic settlement, a fund managed by Elias himself, to provide comprehensive health care for every affected resident, and to establish long-term air quality monitoring. They were forced to invest in state-of-the-art filtration technology, the very kind the Clean Air and Community Protection Act had been designed to mandate. The air in Elias's neighborhood began to clear, literally and metaphorically. The story of what happened in that courtroom became a local legend, a modern fable passed from neighbor to neighbor. Elias Vance, the man they knew as the quiet organizer who fixed screen doors and checked in on the elderly, was revealed to be the silent guardian who had written the very laws that would save them. He became a symbol of the profound, untapped potential that lies within every community. His victory was not just his own. It was a victory for every person who had ever been overlooked, dismissed, or judged by a world too busy to look closely. We see his story conclude not in the cold courtroom, but in the warm, humming heart of his neighborhood. We see him on a sunny afternoon, not giving a speech or leading a protest, but kneeling in the community garden, showing a young girl how to properly plant a tomato seedling. He is back to being who he always was, a man of the people, his hands in the soil, his heart with his neighbors. His greatness was not a performance for a courtroom. It was the steady, quiet work of his entire life. The narrator's voice returns, a final reflection on the powerful drama that unfolded. We build walls around people based on what we see: the color of their skin, the clothes they wear, the title they don't hold. We assume we know their story. We assume we know their worth. Marcus Thorne looked at Elias Vance and saw a pawn, a negligible obstacle. He never imagined he was facing the king. A montage of faces flashes by, people of all ages and backgrounds, each holding a quiet dignity, a hidden story. But what if the person you dismiss is the very architect of the world you're trying to navigate? What if the janitor in the hospital understands the mechanics of compassion better than any doctor? What if the librarian who stamps your books has curated a world of knowledge that could change your life? What if the quietest voice in the room holds the most profound truth? The final shot is of Elias, looking up from the garden, a genuine, heartfelt smile on his face as he watches the children play freely under a clear blue sky. Elias Vance reminded a courtroom, and all of us, that expertise isn't always loud. Dignity isn't always decorated in expensive suits. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is simply know, with unwavering certainty, who you are, and then wait patiently for the rest of the world to catch up. The narrator now addresses the viewer directly, breaking the fourth wall for the final call to action. Don't let the world tell you who you are, and don't you dare assume you know the story of the person standing next to you. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that there is immeasurable greatness in humility. Comment below with a time you misjudged someone, or were misjudged yourself. Let's start a conversation. Let's promise each other to look a little deeper, to listen a little closer, past the cover, and find the brilliant, unexpected story written inside.